My name is Keisha Hamilton, and I am the chair of the Racial Equity Commission here in the city of Jackson. And we are super excited to see you all. There are a few of us racial equity commissioners here. My mission and vision and model of the Racial Equity Commission. Our mission is to transform city policies, practices, and processes to awaken, educate, train, and activate all to invest in interrupting and reversing racism and the impacts of racism and racial prejudice wherever it is encountered. Our vision, what we envision for the city of Jackson, is a vibrant city free of structural racism, actively engaged in eliminating racial prejudice and repairing the harm caused by racial inequities to achieve equity for Jackson's historically marginalized, disenfranchised, and oppressed citizens of color in personal, social, educational, economic, systemic, and structural arenas. Our motto is to racially revolutionize Jackson.
It's nice to see everyone, city leaders as well, citizens, people in the town of Jackson, in the county. This is a great place to live. And I've been living here for a long time and commuting to Oakland University. And for me, it's worth the drive. Although COVID's been pretty good to me, so I'm having a good time now. But when we in the REC always discuss who we're going to bring in. We need new speakers. Who's going to come in? And sometimes, in the last couple times, I'm like, well, I got a colleague, and I'm like, there's a professor, anything. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to let this go. I'm going to keep thinking about it. Then it came up again. I'm like, I got a colleague in she, and then I'm like, okay, well, let's see some info. I'm like, okay. And then I'm like, here's the info. My colleague's like, yeah, we want to talk to her. I'm like, okay, good. And I want to say something in my field. So I don't want to take too long because Keisha only said I was going to do this like 2 hours ago. So we work in the Department of Writing and Rhetoric. And when I gave a business card to a friend of mine, she looked at it and from her point of view, it was like some kind of Orwellian ministry of truth when you say writing and rhetoric. So that's the field we're into. We study how messages are sent on the ground and as they happen. And we look at values and attitudes and try to communicate those values and attitudes to others and try to understand where other people are coming from. That's the best I can do in 30 seconds. It's a contentious field, and that's what we talk about. But I do want to introduce to you Dr. Felicita Arzu-Carmichael, because I just want to emphasize that she's a big deal. But she's not going to say that. And we're happy to have her at OU. And I've been told by other colleagues that whenever there's a big national conference and they see others from other schools talking to Felicita, they're like, get away from Felicita. But no, she has in my conversations I've had with her over the years, where we discuss being uncomfortable with our students about uncomfortable issues. It has challenged me to go beyond what I would normally be afraid to do in the classroom. And in turn, it has challenged me to branch and get out of my house and do work for the community I live in that is meaningful. And I'm glad it's a kind of a full circle thing here to bring Felicita to Jackson to talk with us tonight about how to get this message across and the complexities of it. Okay, I'm done talking. Let us get to our star of the night, Dr., Professor, Director. Oh, and we also run the first year writing program at OU together. Felicita Arzu-Carmichael. Come on.
Good night, everybody. Very excited to be here. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much, Keisha, for the warm introduction. Thank you very much, Dave, my colleague. I'm very appreciative to the entire Racial Equity Committee here, Commission here in Jackson. So I have a couple of things planned for us tonight, but at first I want to get started with a land acknowledgement. And Dave just loaned me this clicker, so I haven't had any practice using it, so please forgive me if I go a little too fast or a little too slow. Oh.
There you go.
Thank you. Thank you so much. All right. So tonight we gather in the city of Jackson, which resides on the ancestral land of the Potawatomi and the Peoria. Additionally, I drew on resources from Oakland University. Oakland University rests on the ancestral contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, known as the Three Fires Confederacy, comprised of the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi. I recognize that our time together and the work that's possible because of these lands is as a result of the forced displacement of Indigenous people. With this awareness, I commit to fostering an inclusive environment by always contextualizing the work I get to do and recognizing the impact of my work on historically marginalized communities. I also recognize that land acknowledgements on their own is not enough. Yet, this is an important social justice practice that names and highlights the impact of systemic inequalities in our communities. During our time together, my goal is to offer some considerations for engaging in equity and inclusion work as coalitional action. To do this, I'll draw on examples from my research, from my teaching, and also from my personal experiences. I'll emphasize the need to shift away from equity and inclusion as abstract ideas and toward actions that seek to bring about material change. This change, I argue, is possible through coalitional work. So I have a few objectives to help us meet this goal, or to help me meet these goals. First, I will share with you my positionality statement for contextualizing who I am and the work that I do. Next, I will share some considerations for engaging constructively in difficult and uncomfortable conversations. Then I will talk about equity and inclusion for building coalitions of action. Finally, I'll conclude and be happy to take any questions that you might have. Welcome. So my name is Dr. Felicita Arzu-Carmichael, as Dave mentioned, and
Did I get the
Keisha.
Carmichael right?
You did, you got it right. Thank you, Dave. I have a master's degree in English Studies for Teachers and a PhD in Rhetoric and Professional Communication from New Mexico State University. Go Aggies. I am an assistant professor, a technical communicator, and a Black feminist scholar, dedicated to inclusion and equity. I teach writing courses that center race and inclusion. I am an associate editor of a peer-reviewed journal called College English. And I am also an associate director of first-year writing, so I get to work closely with Dave in the first-year writing program at Oakland University.
I'm sorry.
I'm also the president of the International Employee Resource Group at Oakland. I identify as a Garifuna and Black Afro-Caribbean teacher scholar. The Garifuna are an indigenous Afro-Caribbean people who are descendants of Arawaks, Carib Native Amerindians from the island of St. Vincent, also known as Yorome, which is Garifuna for homeland, and West African diasporas. I was born in Belize, a beautiful country in Central America and the Caribbean. This Great Lakes state, Michigan, is my new home. Due to my US citizenship, I also identify as a Black American or Belizean American. I am multilingual. I speak, think, and write in a variety of Englishes, along with some Spanish, which is my dad's native language, and Garifuna, the native language of my mom and my father. I'm also fluent in Belize Creole, the lingua franca of my home country. I am an able-bodied, heterosexual, cisgender woman. I use the pronouns she, her, and hers. I am married. My partner is a cisgender white man, and together we have a beautifully blended family with 3 boys. I am Christian, and I was raised middle class. In every writing class that I teach, every presentation that I do, every project that I'm involved in, I am aware that my multiple identities are central to the work that I do. My teaching is influenced by Black feminist thinkers. For example, I follow Black feminist cultural anthropologist Dr. Bianca Williams in enacting what she calls a radical honesty in my work, especially with students. Williams describes radical honesty as a type of inclusive pedagogy that allows us to bring our whole selves to the classroom. It centers emotional wellness and labor, and it values lived experiences. I am naming my positionality because it is relevant to my talk, but also it's important for doing equity and inclusion work. One's positionality offers a lens for us to see how we are positioned relative to others. It highlights those aspects of our social identity, such as race, gender, nationality, religion, and so on in society. When we engage in a particular conversation, when we read certain texts, the same situation and the same text could have a completely different meaning for someone of a different identity because of our positionalities. Rebecca Walton, Kristen Moore, and Natasha Jones, who are all technical scholars in my field, remind us that positionality is fluid, it's contextual. For all of us, our social positions inform how we make sense of the world, and that's important to keep in mind. So based on our positionalities, some conversations surrounding equity and inclusion can be difficult. Throughout my talk, I use the terms equity and inclusion, so I want to spend a little time defining how I'm using these concepts. I follow scholars Kristen Moore, Timothy R. Amidon, and Michelle Simmons in recognizing that it's important to go beyond simply treating everyone the same. Equity requires that resources, money, power, positions shift based on the differing and relative levels of privilege, positionality, and power that various individuals and groups possess. Equity prompts us to think about what resources could be shifted in order to provide additional opportunities for marginalized folks to be successful. Inclusion prompts us to think about what cultural changes could be made in order to provide marginalized folks with a sense of belonging. Importantly, as you can see from this definition of equity and inclusion work toward providing opportunities and a sense of belonging for those who historically have not had those opportunities and have not had that sense of belonging because things like policies and practices have excluded them. Grappling with these issues can be challenging based on our positionality that we occupy. So 2 years ago, in fall 2021, for example, I taught a writing course that introduced students to major topics and issues in my field of writing studies. One of the major projects I asked students to collaborate on required that they interview a professor in our discipline to find out what the professor believed to be key disciplinary values. Students were then to write up their findings and prepare a formal group presentation that they would share with the rest of the class. Before this project was due, one group of students reached out to me via email. They wanted guidance on how to proceed with their project because they were concerned about what they learned from the professor they interviewed. They learned that much of the conversations we were having in class and the scholarship that we were reading about emerging values in the field did not line up with the details this professor was sharing. The students revealed that in addition to sharing their own disciplinary values that they subscribe to, the professor also took the time to share that they had concerns about the direction that our field of writing studies and rhetoric seemed to be headed in. Specifically, the values related to anti-racist pedagogy, linguistic justice, and alternative forms of assessment such as labor-based contract grading. According to my students, the professor indicated that these teaching and assessment forms labeled white professors like themselves as racist, and that therefore the professor did not subscribe to those teaching and assessment forms because they labeled that person as racist. So there were 3 things I shared with my students as a result of this conversation. One, and first, I recognize and I acknowledge the great discomfort that my students felt, given the power dynamic. Even though we had discussed various approaches that scholars in our field take to teaching and assessing students' work because of the values that they hold, and even though we had discussed how the field of writing studies was growing and becoming more inclusive, my students were experiencing in person some of the very tensions that exist in our field. This experience was troubling for them, and they struggled because they did not have the language to articulate the discomfort and to really understand what was occurring in that moment. But what they were experiencing was whiteness at work. So following Oslem and D'Angelo, race scholars define racism as a systemic relationship of unequal power between white people and peoples of color. Whiteness refers to the specific dimension of racism that elevates white people above peoples of color. So in my field of study, a field that is predominantly white, whiteness as an academic discourse is normalized and maintains its power by appearing invisible, but with very severe consequences. So for this professor, good writing and good assessment that benefits all students and that all students need to learn in order to be successful aligned with white ways of knowing and thinking about writing. Secondly, I reminded my students that the assignment asked them to interview a professor, learn about disciplinary values, share them with the class. And so I encouraged them to move forward because they were meeting the expectations of the assignment. And finally, drawing on researchers Sensoy and D'Angelo, Robin D'Angelo, from their brilliant book, Is Everything Really Equal? I shared with students that there is a difference between agreement and understanding, especially when it comes to these issues. That oftentimes when they hear someone says, I don't agree, what they're really saying is, I don't understand. Although what leading scholars in our field describe as inclusive and equitable ways of teaching and learning and assessing, and that these forms do not claim that people in the dominant group are bad or racist, many hear this. So Sensoy and D'Angelo believe, and my experience confirms, that when folks in the dominant group think this way, it's because their current framework of making sense of these issues are binary ways of thinking. In other words, good or bad, racist or not racist. These binary ways of thinking are not helpful because they prevent folks from critically understanding and responding constructively to the issues when they emerge. They also prevent people from moving from an individual view of oppression toward a more systemic view of oppression. Some reasons why folks might think in binary ways, though, is because they rely primarily on hearsay or personal experiences or things we learned from our family growing up. And all of these things are important, but they're not enough to help us make sense of these issues in critically constructive ways. For example, some folks might claim that racism no longer exists because the United States has elected a Black president. or that if you look around, you'll see a lot of Black and brown people in positions of power, and because of that, racism no longer exists, or that somehow it exists in the reverse, which is what this professor was alluding to my students. The problem with using these examples, isolated examples, as proof or as evidence that structural racism no longer exists, or that somehow it's occurring in the reverse, is that we're not able to then pay attention to overall patterns. So even though there are instances where Black, Indigenous, and peoples of color do occupy leadership positions, historically, that has not been the pattern. Therefore, it is important for us to move beyond anecdotal evidence and moving toward examining patterns. So as we're thinking about how to engage productively in difficult conversations and uncomfortable conversations, both during our time together tonight and outside the scope of tonight's event, and we're thinking about the many feelings, right? We get all kinds of feelings that emerge from having these conversations. We have to remember that what we need to make sense of this is a critical framework. Importantly, those feelings, the guilt, the shame, the anger, those are not necessarily problematic or wrong. But what's important is that we then take that discomfort and channel it into something beneficial or productive. In other words, it depends what we do with it. So these strong emotions can create opportunities for a very deep self-awareness. The positionality statement that I shared in the beginning, I encourage all of my students to write that statement, to begin creating this deep self-awareness. So some questions, though, that Sensoya and D'Angelo suggest that we ask ourselves when we're engaging in these conversations include, what about my life in relation to race, class, gender might make it difficult for me to see or validate this new perspective? What do my reactions reveal about what I perceive is at risk were I to accept this information? And if I were to accept this information as valid, what might ethically be required of me? A few final thoughts as we think about engaging constructively. And again, I'm drawing from Is Everything Really Equal from Özlem Sensoy and Robin DiAngelo's work. A strong opinion is not the same as informed knowledge, right? And we've been socialized to believe that the opinions we have are valid, but they're not the same as informed opinion, informed knowledge. There is a difference between agreement and understanding when discussing complex dynamics. So I don't agree might mean I don't understand, as I talked about earlier, which is possibly what my students were hearing from this professor. I don't really understand these issues. We have a deep interest in denying those forms of oppression that benefit us. And along those same lines, we may also have an interest in denying forms of oppression that harm us. Very difficult feelings. Move beyond anecdotal evidence to examining patterns, and I talked about why that's important to not rely on only hearsay or personal teachings from our families. We don't have to be aware of oppression in order for it to exist. Our racial position will greatly affect our ability to see racism. I taught a class, this semester I'm teaching a class called Race, Social Justice and Professional Writing, and just today, this is one of the things that came up. I don't know how to explain racism, I don't know how to discuss it because I haven't experienced it, but I know it exists, right? So that level of thinking is really important. Putting our efforts into protecting rather than expanding our worldview prevents our emotional and intellectual growth. And so on the previous slide, I shared 3 questions. Some ways that we can think about those 3 questions. Some ways that we can begin to think about responding to those questions, and much of the answers to them require that we reflect on, again, our positionality, a concept I discussed earlier, along with recognizing our privileges, the privileges that we have, and the power we have to act as a result. And so Walton, Moore, and Jones theorized these three factors as one's margin of maneuverability. So at the beginning of my talk, I named my positionality. One's positionality highlights those aspects of our social identity, such as race, gender, class, and so on. And it highlights that our perceptions are shaped by them. It emphasizes that our background gives us a particular lens through which we see the world, but also what we don't see. For example, I see myself as a Black cisgender immigrant woman, scholar. And so that's my positionality. Next, for Walton, Moore, and Jones, privilege refers to the kinds of unearned advantages that we have. It focuses on how our identity functions in social contexts. So, for example, what unearned advantages do I have as a Black cisgender immigrant woman? So both of those two concepts, our positionality and the privileges that we have, when we pay attention to those two things, it can help us determine how much power we have that can allow us to take action. So scholars in our field refer to this as our margin of maneuverability. We all have different margins of maneuverability that allow us to take action based on those two things, right? Our positionality and privilege. Because doing equity and inclusion work depends on our margin of maneuverability, right? Positionality, privilege, and power, and each of our margins are different. Doing equity work requires coalitional action. So how do we build them? How do we build coalitions? Coalitions are built first through listening and valuing the differences that we have. Importantly, coalitional action is different from support. In distinguishing between solidarity and support, for example, Black feminist scholar Bell Hooks writes, solidarity is not the same as support. To experience solidarity, we must have a community of interests, shared beliefs, and goals around which to unite and build sisterhood. Support can be occasional. It can be given and just as easily withdrawn. Solidarity requires sustained, ongoing commitment. It is the difference between being an ally, showing support, or being a co-conspirator. Being in solidarity and taking action against racism and oppression requires sustained, ongoing commitment. So solidarity, not support. Being a co-conspirator and not just an ally. This sustained, ongoing commitment manifests through equitable, inclusive policies, practices, and procedures. Because, for example, when academic institutions admit students from a diversity of backgrounds, or when hiring agencies hire people from a diversity of backgrounds, that's inclusion, but it does not mean that it automatically creates inclusive and equitable policies and practices. So in addition to our positionality, our privilege, and our power that we all have, our margins of maneuverability, Walton, Moore, and Jones suggest 4 heuristics to promote coalitional action that they call the 4 R's. Recognize injustice, reveal that injustice, reject that injustice, ideally this happens in coalitions, and replace that unjust behavior or system with something else. So in what follows, I want to offer an example for how these frameworks, our margins of maneuverability, and also the 4 R's, what that looked like for some of the work that I do. And this also invites us to think about equity and inclusion beyond these abstract ideas into something that is actionable. Before I talk about that example, though, I do want to pose 3 questions for your consideration that I'll come back to toward the end of my talk. So what written and unwritten rules, expectations, procedures, guidelines, or processes shape the culture within your institution? What aspects of your policy seem to hinder or promote important aspects of equity? And how have you embraced the value of equity and inclusion, so doing coalitional work? How does that commitment translate to structural processes that could engender material change? So during my last experience on the academic job market, I had some interesting and troubling experiences. Specifically, as I was interacting with the documents, hiring documents, application forms, and so on. At that time, I was an international graduate student. I mentioned that I'm an immigrant, so I was a student on an F1 visa. And at the time, I was also the only Black student in my cohort going on the job market. There were about 4 or 5 of us in the graduate program. And so as a multiply marginalized student scholar at the time, the challenges for me emerged when I would visit these application portals and encountered questions such as, can you provide proof, if hired, that you are eligible to work in the United States? Are you legally eligible for employment in the United States? Are you currently authorized to lawfully work in the United States on a full-time basis? Are you currently authorized to work in the United States? If hired, can you present evidence of your U.S. citizenship or proof of your legal rights to live and work in the United States? And are you prevented from lawfully becoming employed in this country because of immigration or visa status? So these were some of the questions that I grappled with when I was applying for jobs. Some of the language have very strong emotional implications, which to an international applicant can evoke a sensation of fear and vulnerability. I shared this experience with a colleague of mine, Dr. Josephine Walema, and I told her that one of the reasons I was inclined to apply to the institution that I now work is because I didn't experience too many of these kinds of barriers. Josephine, she goes by Josie, who is also a Black immigrant woman, is a tenured professor, and at the time, she had already gone through all of these processes. She then looked at me and said, you should study that. And I said, no, we've had similar experiences. We should study this. And so this dialogue and that shared experience was the beginning of an extended inquiry into policies and practices that educational institutions rely on for their hiring of international graduate students and faculty of other immigrant backgrounds. It was also the start of our coalition building. So because Josie and I are both multiply marginalized, our margin of maneuverability manifested in really interesting and unique ways. So when it comes to privilege, Josie is a tenured professor, which gave her relative privilege in terms of academic freedom. I am on the tenure track, but I also hold an executive position at my institution, the president of the International Employee Resource Group, which gives me some access to some institutional resources. In terms of positionality, we are both members of the community that we're advocating for, scholars in the field of immigrant backgrounds who ourselves have navigated the job market. So in terms of recognizing these 4 R's, recognize, reveal, reject, and replace, in addition to our margins of maneuverability, what follows, I want to go through each of these steps to show you what it looked like in my work. So first, recognize the injustice. Maybe a little bit of help. I knew that was gonna happen. I was so excited, so excited. I have to slow down. So recognize the injustice.
What slide are we on?
It says recognize the injustice.
Okay, here we go. Reveal.
Yes. So as I discussed earlier, I had recognized my experience with the language on the job description as more than just technical language or boilerplate language. When I revealed my discomforts to Josie, She concurred and also recognized her experiences and challenges. Both of our experiences suggest that institutions assume the norm, that job candidates would already be authorized to work in the United States. Thus, candidates who deviate from that norm are thus seen as bringing our otherness to that otherwise normative space. This is exclusionary and thus does not line up with universities' openly stated commitments to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Our experiences allowed us to recognize the potential injustice that these documents were causing to international scholars. Importantly, our positionality also informed the kinds of questions that we asked and about our experiences on the job market. Our racial position, as I mentioned earlier, greatly affects our ability to see racism and to see injustices. The second step is to reveal the injustice.
Oh, I got there.
Thank you, Dave. Appreciate you. Awesome. Reveal. That's why we work so well together. Reveal that injustice. So, of course, recognizing the injustice is only the first step. Action must be taken. After Josie and I affirmed each other's experience, we came up with a plan to reveal it by investigating and gathering evidence. So to investigate more closely whether the language in job descriptions was inclusive and the impact that this might have on hiring practices, we reviewed current US labor and immigration laws in contrast to the language of academic job descriptions and application portals. We were guided by two questions. One, how is the language of job descriptions and application portals aligned with or different from US labor and immigration policies? And two, in what ways does the language in job descriptions and application portals include or exclude international scholar applicants? What we learned in the 52 documents we studied was that while our academic fields actively seek to accept, recruit, train students from marginalized and underrepresented communities, such as international students, after they complete their programs, this diversity in training programs has not corresponded to inclusive language in academic job descriptions that impact the hiring prospects of international faculty. While international students initially arrive in the US as non-immigrants on a student visa, many change their status to become immigrants who seek employment for those positions they've been trained here for. Despite this reality, institutions have continued to assume the norm that candidates would already be authorized to work in the US or are US citizens. Thus, despite US universities' openly stated commitments to DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, in the job descriptions and in marketing and promotional documents, hiring international scholars as faculty is still fraught with obstacles. This practice validates Sarah Ahmed's assertion that a commitment does not necessarily commit the institution to anything or to do anything. In other words, the language such as the institution celebrates diversity or that the institution is hiring applicants who can contribute to social justice, equity, and inclusion reflect an equitable hiring disposition that international scholars would perceive as welcoming until it is juxtaposed against the language of legality, and citizenship. For example, in our study, we observed that some institutions indicate that work authorization should be established at the time the application is submitted, whereas others indicated that if you're hired, you will need proof of identity and documentation of US citizenship or legal authorization to work. Another institution indicated that applicants must be authorized to work in the United States for the duration of employment without assistance from the institution. While this institution did not explicitly draw on immigration policies to justify its employment requirement, only US citizens or permanent residents would have authorization to work for the duration of employment. Since international scholars, work visa is temporary and contingent upon employment sponsorship, they do not qualify. This kind of language also automatically excludes international scholars on visas because they do not fit in either of these categories. However, a lack of fit within these categories does not render international scholars legally ineligible to apply. That is because this restriction does not, in fact, align with US labor and immigration policies, which are primarily centered on preventing employers from knowingly hiring illegal immigrants. To be clear, my collaborator and I were not arguing that institutions be mandated to hire international scholars upon graduation. Rather, we argue that as a matter of communicating technical information and accounting for the complex positionalities of all students on the job market, the language and job descriptions and application portals, along with hiring policies and practices, should not convey conflicting information to applicants, information that does not accurately reflect USCIS regulations. We wanted to reveal that hiring committees must pay attention to whom they are privileging based on the language that they use. We also wanted to reveal how policies and practices systematically exploit one social group in order to benefit another. This is the very definition of oppression. Oppression is the prejudice and discrimination of one's social group against another that's backed by legal authority and historical, social, and institutional power. So I'm cutting some parts out, but we drafted up our findings in preparation to call out and reveal these exclusionary practices. We submitted our findings in the form of a manuscript for publication. And so in 2021, our article, "Are You Authorized to Work in the United States? Investigating Inclusive Practices in Rhetoric and Technical Communication Job Descriptions," was published in Technical Communications Quarterly, which is one of the leading peer-reviewed journals in our field. Our positionality and relative privilege gave us some power to advocate for inclusive and equitable practices that might lead to effecting change. Now, the third R is, so we recognize and reveal the injustice, and now we have to work toward rejecting it. So in seeking change, we work to take this a step further. Inclusion and equity work cannot be limited to individual actions or perspectives because the oppressions that it targets is structural. In targeting structural oppressions that made the hiring prospects of international scholars inequitable, we did three things. And I won't go into detail about the three things, I'll just tell you what they are. But one, the published article, we extended that study. So what we tried to do next is to find out from graduate programs at different universities what they're doing in terms of what we call a distributed responsibilities to support all graduates, particularly international students, to compete equitably in the US job market. The second thing we did is we took our study and we presented them at nationally recognized conferences. So the Conference on College Composition and Communication is the world's largest conference in our field. We presented our study there, and we also presented at the Association for Teachers of Technical Writing, ATTW. And the third thing actually recently happened just a few weeks ago at my institution. I collaborated with some international employees at Oakland to organize an immigration seminar, and we invited an external immigration attorney to come to Oakland. And the purpose of that seminar was to inform international graduate students and employees about recent changes to immigration policies and to discuss with them the different processes involved in changing status. Changing your status and being an immigrant in this country is very hard and is very daunting. And so our goal is to provide a sense of community for folks that are going through that, but then also to provide them with information and resources through this immigration lawyer that we invited. And the final R is to replace that unjust behavior with something else. So Moore, Walton, and Jones affirmed that in most cases, replacing unjust behaviors, policies, or procedures is a process that requires many steps, including additional reveals. Coalitional thinking orients us toward others who want to make change and allow individuals to borrow. So remember that concept of the margin of maneuverability that we all have that's different. That's why it's important to work in coalition, because someone might have more privilege than the other, and then you can essentially borrow, right? So that coalitional thinking and that coalitional work is so important. Through our study advocacy on our various campuses and our service work, we hope to provide our field of study and academic institutions more broadly with policies, practices, and procedures they can draw on to ensure more equitable and inclusive professionalization and hiring practices. Okay, wrapping up really quickly. To recap, doing equity and inclusion work requires that we pay attention to our positionality, our privilege and power, and also that we recognize injustice, that we reveal the injustice, that we reject that injustice, and then we replace it with something else. And recognizing that that replace might require more reveal. So it's a process that happens in coalition. I hope that the details I shared with you tonight offer some ways of thinking about doing equity and inclusion work that might lead to positive social changes in your institutions and within this beautiful community in Jackson. And I'd like to return to those questions that I asked earlier in the beginning. So thinking about what policies you currently have at your own institutions that might be welcoming to folks, but that might also be exclusion. I'm summarizing the 3 questions because I don't want to ask Dave to have to pull those back up again.
I'm looking for them right now.
But that's all I got for y'all tonight. I'm happy to talk more in the next couple of minutes with the wonderful panelists. And thank you so much for your attention and for your time tonight. Thank you.